Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq from Washington. I'm Jassim Azawi. The war on Iraq has linked Iraq and the US forever. US troops might leave Iraq one day, but the US invasion of Iraq will have deep political and military ramifications for the entire Middle East for decades to come. No one knows that better than Michael Gordon, the chief military correspondent of the New York Times and the co-author of the bestseller Cobra II, an authoritative account of the invasion of Iraq and its aftermath. Welcome to Inside Iraq. You are one of a select few journalists and American writers interviewed both presidential candidates, Barack Obama and John McCain. Let's start with these interviews you've done. What would be the major difference between the two candidates vis-a-vis Iraq?
Well, I think there are some profound differences, and I've had the chance to interview both Senator Obama and Senator McCain within the last several weeks as they went along the campaign trail on the specific subject of Iraq and how they would handle that. And I think among the differences are, first of all, the question of how fast they would take out American forces. Senator Obama has talked about taking out the combat brigades on a 16-month schedule, which is twice as fast as the American forces would leave under the draft American-Iraqi agreement. And Senator McCain really favors an approach that is really more what he calls conditions-based. It would be more flexible. He would give a lot more credence to the recommendations of the American commanders on the ground and sort of adjust as events unfold on Iraq within the context of this American-Iraqi agreement. But the bigger difference is just how much importance these two candidates would give to Iraq. I mean, Senator McCain views Iraq and the outcome of Iraq is of prime importance. He really thinks that's one of the sort of principal so-called battlegrounds against terrorism, and he thinks it's very important for the future of the Middle East.
Is it simply because it worked for him, it propelled him to the top of the candidates on the Republican Party, and he's the nominee of that party?
No, I think he's thought for a long time that Iraq is a very important country, just in terms of its influence in the region, in terms of there's certainly the potential for if the conflict was to reignite there, it might destabilize nations in the region. I think he also sees an opportunity, I don't know whether he's correct or not, but I think he sees an opportunity to forge a constructive relationship with the new Iraqi government and to have a kind of an ally or at least a partner in certain areas. And I think Senator Obama has made it quite clear that he thinks Iraq is not so important. He thinks Afghanistan is more important than Iraq, just as an arena to fight terrorism. And so Obama would put more weight on Afghanistan, McCain would put more weight on Iraq.
To the degree that he reserved for himself the right to overrule military commanders and their recommendations regarding those troops in Iraq. From a military point of view, and you are the correspondent, military correspondent of the New York Times, does that really work out? I mean, if General Oderno in the near future, he says, Mr. President, the situation is still dicey, we need to still keep the forces here. Can President Obama says, I know better than you, I need to pull 5 brigades and send them to Afghanistan?
Well, let's look at what happened when Senator Obama went to Baghdad. He had a meeting with General Petraeus, and according to Senator Obama, who discussed this with me in my interview, General Petraeus made the case for retaining maximum flexibility in adjusting American force levels, and Senator Obama made the case for shifting some of these forces to Afghanistan. So there are differences of emphasis.
What does that betray, in your opinion?
Well, I think it betrays what I just said. I think it shows that Senator Obama gives much more weight to trying to improve the situation in Afghanistan and is prepared to accept, I think, a minimally acceptable outcome in Iraq as a trade-off. But I think the reality is, and I think you made a very important point, General Petraeus is going to be the head of the Central Command, taking over in a few weeks formally. General Oderno is the theater commander in Iraq. And even under Senator Obama's own proposal, he would keep, after he took out the combat brigades, he would keep a residual force, probably of 30 to 50,000 troops for counterterrorism to train the Iraqi forces, force protection and whatnot. I think it will not be so easy for Senator Obama to directly countermand the advice of his commander. So I think I think probably what would happen is after he gets in office, and I'm assuming that's likely, although I can't tell the future, I think it's likely he would adjust his position.
You spent perhaps the last 7 months of the last 15 months in Iraq. You visited many provinces, including Diyala and Mosul and Iraq. And right now, you are quite cognizant of the strength of the Iraqi army. Right now also, there is a negotiation underway between the US government and Iraq regarding the status of forces in Iraq. Are we getting close to the beginning of the drawdown of US forces?
Well, there will be a drawdown of American forces because the Iraqi government desires it as part of this new agreement where they've set a date goal of having American forces leave by the end of 2011. But I've seen the Iraqi military up close, and it's greatly improved over recent years, and it's also increased in size. And size counts in a nation like Iraq.
But is it professional? Is it efficient? Is it nationalistic?
It's sufficiently nationalistic that you can take a battalion or so from Anbar, move it to Basra, to Sadr City. But it's got some limitations and some considerable ones. For example, I was in Sadr City and I saw the Iraqi Army up close. And if they're fighting a militia, they depend heavily on air power. I mean, Apache helicopters or airstrikes to help them out. Well, that's supplied by the Americans. There's still some limitations on their training. I saw American soldiers go up to Iraqi Jundi and tell them how to properly fire an M16. They still tend to shoot a little wildly when they get excited. And I was there in Sadr City when an entire Iraqi company left against the orders of its commanders because it felt the situation was too dangerous. I wrote a whole page-1 story about it for the New York Times. Now, that was the downside. That commander was detained and put in jail, and by the next day, the Iraqi generals had another company up there, which is a positive thing. But the point is, the Iraqi military still depends substantially on American support, and they did in the Basra campaign as well.
Let us get another example, Michael. Recently, perhaps in the last 6 weeks, we saw a glimpse of perhaps the future, the confrontation between the Iraqi army and the Peshmerga and Khanaqin in Diyala, when the Prime Minister pretty much gave a warning to the Peshmerga to leave the area within a very short span of time. They did not. All what happened that the Iraqi army pulled to the hamlets and the little villages surrounding Khanaqin, and the Peshmerga also left, but the situation is still dicey. Do you see a situation where that confrontation between the center and the south with the north coming, if one party does not relent?
Well, I don't know. Is the truthful answer. Certainly we had that confrontation in the south in Basra when Prime Minister Maliki
and the Americans came to help the Iraqi chestnut out of the fire.
Yeah, what actually happened at an instance, and I was in Iraq then, was the Prime Minister decided on his own initiative to launch an offensive in Basra. He notified General Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker just days before this thing unfolded. They got down there, and then they ran into a little bit of difficulty. And yes, the Iraqi troops did the fighting in Basra, but the Americans decided they had to get behind it, and they rushed to help by sending advisors from the 82nd Airborne, by providing air power, Predator drone support, all sorts of things that they took to make this work. I'm hoping there won't be those sorts of confrontations in the north.
The reason why we are interested in that story, because it shows that call, that military campaign, was it driven by the military commanders on the ground, or was it at the political echelon of Iraqi government say, okay, let's do it, regardless what the recommendation of the Iraqi general said?
You're talking about the Basra campaign?
The Basra campaign?
The Basra campaign was initiated by the Prime Minister, and he certainly, there was certainly a rationale for it. Basra was out of control. The British forces had essentially left an entirely chaotic situation behind them. The militias were running wild. There were valid reasons for seeking to regain control over Basra, but the way the decision was made in a little bit of an impetuous way, and some people think there was also a political motivation at work as well, which is that anticipating that there would be provincial elections and then later national elections, the Prime Minister, as a representative of the Dawa Party with allies for the Supreme Council, was trying to sort of create a political situation where the Sadrists and other rival factions would be weakened in anticipation of these elections.
Michael Gordon will take a short break now. When we come back, we are going to talk about the status of forces negotiation between the U.S. and Iraq. I'm going to ask you about whether there are caveats regarding that statement. Stay with us. We'll be back very soon.
The next president of the United States is not going to have to address the issue as to whether we went into Iraq or not. The next president of the United States is going to have to decide how we leave, when we leave, and what we leave behind.